A billionaire saw his maid sleeping on the raining street and gave her something no one ever expected. If you love emotional, unforgettable stories that stay with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. We've got so many more coming your way. The rain hit Manhattan like God himself was ringing out the heavens. Elliot Grayson stepped out of his black Bentley with the confidence of a man who owned half the city. At 34, he built an empire on steel nerves and calculated risks. Every move deliberate, every emotion locked away behind a fortress of designer suits and cold efficiency. He pulled his coat tighter against the October chill, already mentally rehearsing tomorrow's board meeting. The parking garage entrance glowed under harsh fluorescent lights, casting everything in that clinical white that matched his perfectly ordered world. That's when he saw her. A heap of soaked fabric huddled against the concrete wall. At first, his mind refused to process it. Probably some homeless person who'd wandered too close to his building. He'd call security in the morning. But something made him pause. Something about the way the small figure curled in on herself, protecting something precious. The blanket. He recognized that blanket. It was the same faded blue throw that disappeared from his penthouse's guest room 3 months ago. The one he'd assumed the housekeeper had donated or thrown away. The one that now covered a shivering form pressed against the cold wall of his parking garage. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The face that turned toward the dim light wasn't the weathered features of a stranger. It was her, Callie Torres, 23 years old, with those impossibly kind brown eyes that always looked away when he entered a room. The woman who'd been cleaning his penthouse for 6 months with a quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible. His maid was sleeping on the street. The world tilted. Elliot Grayson, who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, who'd fired executives with the casual indifference of ordering coffee, stood frozen in the rain watching his employee, his responsibility, curl tighter against the wall that belonged to him. She was so still, too still. For one terrifying moment, he thought. But then she shivered, and the relief that flooded through him was so intense it left him dizzy. How long had she been here? How long had he walked past this entrance, climbed into his warm car, driven to his heated penthouse, while she lay 20 feet away in the rain? The questions came like a flood, each one hitting harder than the last. Where was her apartment? Why wasn't she home? Why was she here, of all places, sleeping rough outside the building where she worked? And underneath it all, the question that made his chest tight with something he couldn't name. How had he never noticed? Thunder rolled overhead, and she stirred. Elliot watched as her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. She blinked against the rain, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer or a plea. That's when it hit him like a physical blow. She wasn't just homeless. She was sick. The flush on her cheeks wasn't from the cold. It was fever. Elliot found himself moving before his mind caught up. His umbrella snapped open with military precision as he crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. The logical part of his brain, the part that had built his fortune, screamed warnings about liability and complications and getting involved. He ignored it completely. Kneeling beside her, he could see the full extent of her condition. The blanket was soaked through. Her clothes, the same simple uniform she wore to clean his house, clung to her small frame. Her breathing was shallow, labored. This wasn't just someone down on their luck. This was his employee, dying by degrees outside his building while he slept in Egyptian cotton sheets 40 floors above. The shame hit him like a physical force. But shame was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. Not when Callie's lips were turning blue and her entire body was shaking with violent tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. He reached out and touched her shoulder gently. Callie. Her eyes snapped open, wild with panic. She scrambled backward against the wall, the blanket falling away to reveal clothes so thin they might as well have been tissue paper. Her gaze darted around like a cornered animal looking for escape routes. Please don't. The words came out as a croak, barely audible above the rain. Please don't call the police. Please don't fire me. I'll move. I'll find somewhere else. Just please. The desperation in her voice cut through him like a blade. This woman who cleaned his home with meticulous care, who always left everything spotless and never asked for anything, was begging him not to destroy what little she had left. Callie, stop. His voice came out sharper than he intended, and she flinched. He forced himself to soften his tone. I'm not calling anyone. I'm not firing you. She stared at him with those enormous brown eyes, searching his face for deception. The rain continued to pour down around them, but neither moved. In that moment, suspended between crisis and decision, Elliot realized he was looking at a stranger. 6 months. 6 months she'd worked in his home, and he knew nothing about her. Not where she lived, not whether she had family, not that she was one missed paycheck away from sleeping in the rain. The successful businessman who prided himself on knowing every detail of every deal had completely missed the human being who kept his life running smoothly. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long what? How long have you been sleeping out here?" She looked away, and he had his answer. Not just tonight. Multiple nights. While he'd been complaining about quarterly projections and stock prices, she'd been fighting for survival 20 feet from his front door. The rain intensified, drumming against his umbrella with increasing force. In the distance, lightning split the sky, illuminating her face in stark detail. She looked so young, too young to carry whatever burden had brought her to this moment. "Get in the car," he said. "What?" "Get in the car, Callie. Now." "I can't. I don't. Mr. Grayson, I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept charity. I have my pride." "Your pride." The words exploded out of him before he could stop them. "Your pride is going to get you killed. You're burning with fever, you're soaked to the bone, and you're arguing with me about charity?" She flinched again, and immediately he regretted the outburst. But the fear was making him angry. Fear that he'd been too late, that she was sicker than she looked, that his comfortable ignorance had contributed to this disaster. "Please," he said, gentler this time. "Just get in the car. We'll figure everything else out later." She studied his face for a long moment, and he found himself holding his breath. Everything balanced on her answer. If she said no, if she disappeared into the night, he knew with absolute certainty that he'd never forgive himself. Finally, slowly, she nodded. He helped her to her feet, supporting more of her weight than he'd expected. She was lighter than she should be, frailier than someone her age had any right to be. The blanket dragged behind them as they walked to his car, leaving a trail of water on the concrete. The elevator to Elliot's penthouse had never felt so slow. Callie sat wrapped in his coat, cashmere that probably cost more than she made in 2 months, while he watched the floor numbers climb. She hadn't spoken since getting in the car, and the silence was eating him alive. 40 floors. 40 floors between the street where she'd been sleeping and the luxury apartment she cleaned every Tuesday and Friday. Had she ever thought about that irony? Had she ever stood in his marble bathroom, scrubbing his imported fixtures, and wondered how it would feel to have a roof over her head that didn't disappear at midnight? The elevator chimed softly as they reached the penthouse. The doors opened to reveal his foyer, gleaming hardwood, minimalist artwork, everything precisely arranged. Through her eyes, it must look like another planet. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered as he guided her inside. "This isn't appropriate. If someone sees." "No one's going to see anything," he said firmly. "And even if they did, I don't care what anyone thinks." That wasn't entirely true. Elliot Grayson had built his reputation on caring very much what people thought. Image was everything in his world. But looking at Callie, really looking at her, he realized that some things mattered more than image. Like the fact that she was swaying on her feet. "Bathrooms this way," he said, leading her down the hallway she'd walked hundreds of times with her cleaning supplies. But tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't the invisible help. She was his guest. The guest bathroom was larger than most people's bedrooms, all marble and gold fixtures. He turned on the shower, adjusting the temperature while she stood in the doorway looking lost. "There are towels in the cabinet," he said, "and I'll find you something dry to wear." She nodded but didn't move. The fever was making her sluggish, her responses delayed. "Callie," he said gently, "when's the last time you ate?" The question seemed to surprise her. She blinked slowly, as if calculating. "Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe Tuesday. Today was Thursday." The anger rose in him again, swift and sharp. Not at her, never at her, but at the circumstances that had brought her to this point. At himself for not seeing it sooner. "I'll make you something," he said. "You don't have to." "Stop." The word came out harder than he intended. "Stop apologizing. Stop saying I don't have to. Just take a shower and get warm." He left her there and went to raid his kitchen. When was the last time he'd actually cooked? Usually, his meals were catered affairs or business dinners at 5-star restaurants. But he found soup in the pantry, probably left by his housekeeper, and managed to heat it without burning down the penthouse. 20 minutes later, she emerged from the bathroom wearing his NYU sweatshirt and a pair of his sweatpants that she'd had to roll up several times. Her hair was damp but clean, and some color had returned to her cheeks. She looked impossibly young and impossibly fragile. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the kitchen island. It was strange, having her in this space as something other than his employee. Strange and somehow right in a way that made him uncomfortable. She ate the soup slowly, methodically, like someone who'd learned not to waste food. He wanted to ask questions, 100 questions, but something told him to wait. Let her eat. Let her get warm. The interrogation could come later. But she surprised him by speaking first. "The shelter has a rule," she said quietly, not looking up from her bowl. "You have to be back by 10 p.m. or you lose your spot for the night." Shelter. The word hit him like a physical blow. "I was working late because you had that dinner party last week. Remember? You asked me to stay and help with the cleanup after the caterers left." He remembered. He'd barely looked at her that night, just handed her an extra $50 and told her to make sure everything was perfect for his breakfast meeting the next morning. "By the time I got to the shelter, it was 10:05, she continued. "They'd already given my bed away. 5 minutes. She'd lost her place to sleep because she'd stayed late to clean up after his party and arrived 5 minutes past their arbitrary deadline. How long have you been staying there?" 3 months. She took another spoonful of soup, her hands steadier now. "Since my landlord raised the rent on our apartment. I couldn't afford it anymore. Not with." She trailed off. Not with what? She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My mom is sick. Really sick. The kind of sick that means machines and medications and doctors who don't take insurance." She looked up at him then, and the pain in her eyes was devastating. "Every dollar I make goes to keeping her alive. Every single dollar." The pieces began falling into place. The weight loss he'd attributed to her being naturally thin. The way she never took breaks during her shifts, working with the focused intensity of someone who couldn't afford to lose time. The fact that she'd never asked for a raise, never complained about anything, never caused even the smallest inconvenience. Because she couldn't afford to. "What about your family? Other relatives who could help?" "It's just me and Mom and my little brother David. He's 17, still in high school. Smart kid, really smart. He has a chance to get out of this cycle, go to college, make something of himself." Her voice grew fierce. "But not if I can't keep Mom stable until he graduates." "And your father?" The look she gave him was answer enough. "So you work here, and where else?" "Cleaning offices downtown 3 nights a week. And I pick up shifts at the grocery store on weekends when they need extra help." 3 jobs. She was working 3 jobs, sleeping in a shelter, and still couldn't make ends meet. While he complained about the stock market and worried about which charity gala to attend. "Why didn't you ask for help?" The question came out before he could stop it, and immediately he saw her bristle. "Ask who?" "You." She set down her spoon. "Mr. Grayson, you've never asked me my last name. In 6 months of working in your home, you've never asked if I need anything, if I have family, if I'm okay. Why would I think you'd want to hear about my problems?" The accusation stung because it was true. Completely, undeniably true. "I pay attention to my business," he said defensively. "And I'm not your business. I'm your employee. There's a difference." She was right, of course. He'd reduced her to a function. Someone who made his life easier without complications or personal entanglements. He'd wanted invisible help, and she'd given him exactly that. Even to the point of sleeping on the street rather than risk losing the job she desperately needed. "The night you found me," she said suddenly. "That wasn't the first time. I've been sleeping outside for a week, ever since the shelter's waiting list got too long. Usually I find doorways farther from the building, but that night the rain was so bad." She shrugged. "I thought your parking garage would at least keep me dry." A week. She'd been homeless for a week, and he'd been oblivious. "Tomorrow," she said, standing up and folding the napkin neatly beside her empty bowl. "I'll find somewhere else to go. I won't be a problem for you anymore." "Where?" he asked. "Where will you go?" "I'll figure something out. I always do." "What if you don't? What if there's nowhere?" She looked at him with those enormous brown eyes, and for a moment he saw her armor crack. Saw the fear she'd been hiding beneath all that careful politeness and desperate pride. "Then I'll sleep outside again," she said simply, "until I find something else." The casualness of it, the way she stated her willingness to risk her life as if it were a minor inconvenience, made something break inside his chest. "No," he said. "Excuse me." I said no. "You're not sleeping outside. Not tonight. Not tomorrow night. Not ever again." She stared at him. "Mr. Grayson, I appreciate what you've done tonight, but I can't stay here. It's not appropriate, and I won't be anyone's charity case." "Then don't be my charity case," he said, the solution crystallizing in his mind with startling clarity. "Be my guest." "What's the difference?" "Guests are invited. Charity cases are pitted." He stood up, beginning to pace. "Stay in the guest room. Just until you figure something else out. I can't pay you rent." "I'm not asking for rent." "Then what are you asking for?" He stopped pacing and looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who'd been keeping his life running smoothly while fighting battles he'd never imagined. This person he'd reduced to a function, who'd turned out to be so much more complex and courageous than he'd ever bothered to discover. "I'm asking you to let me help," he said quietly. "Just this once. Just until you get back on your feet." She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. Why? It was a fair question. Why did he care? Why was he willing to complicate his perfectly ordered life for someone he'd barely acknowledged existed? "Because," he said finally, "finding you on that street tonight was the first time in years I felt ashamed of myself. And I don't like the person that shame reveals." She blinked, clearly not expecting that level of honesty. "One night," she said finally. "Just until I can figure out what to do next." He wanted to argue, to insist on longer, but something told him that pushing would only make her run. So he nodded. "One night." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. One night wouldn't be nearly enough to fix what was broken here. The question was whether she'd trust him enough to find out what enough actually looked like. As he showed her to the guest room, the same room she'd cleaned dozens of times, he caught her looking around with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What is it?" "Nothing," she said softly. "It's just, I always wondered what it would feel like to sleep in a real bed again." The confession broke his heart and made him angry all at once. How long had it been since she'd had a real bed? How many nights had she spent on shelter cots or cold pavement while he'd taken his comfort for granted? "Callie," he said as she reached for the door handle. "Thank you for everything you've done for me. I should have said that a long time ago." She gave him a small, sad smile. "Good night, Mr. Grayson." "Elliot," he said. "Call me Elliot." She nodded and disappeared behind the door, leaving him standing in the hallway of his own home, feeling like a stranger. He'd thought finding her on the street was the crisis. But as he lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, he realized the truth. Finding Callie Torres wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. Elliot woke to the smell of coffee and something else, something warm and homey that had never existed in his sterile penthouse before. For a moment, he lay in bed confused. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back. The rain, the parking garage, Callie's fever-bright eyes as she begged him not to fire her. He checked his phone. 7:30 a.m. His alarm wouldn't go off for another hour, but something had pulled him from sleep. The smell, maybe, or the subtle sounds of movement in his kitchen. When he emerged from his bedroom, he found her at his stove, fully dressed in her work clothes. Somehow she'd managed to dry and press them overnight, flipping what looked like perfect pancakes. "You're up early," he said, and she startled, nearly dropping the spatula. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. I just wanted to make breakfast before I left." To say thank you. Left. The word hit him like ice water. She'd set the table with his good china, the set he'd never used, bought by a decorator and left to gather dust in his cabinets. There were pancakes, bacon, fresh fruit arranged artfully in a bowl. Coffee that smelled infinitely better than anything his expensive machine had ever produced. "This is incredible," he said, and meant it. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mom taught me before she got sick." A shadow crossed her face. She used to say that food was love made edible. Before she got sick. Another reminder of the weight this 23-year-old carried on her shoulders. "You said you were leaving." She nodded, not meeting his eyes. "I found a spot in a different shelter. It's across town, but they have openings." "What about your jobs? If you're sleeping across town, how will you get to work?" "I'll figure it out. Take the subway, maybe walk part of the way." "Walk?" "In October. In New York. After working 3 jobs and sleeping in a shelter." "Callie, that's insane. Do you know how long that commute would be?" "It doesn't matter." Her voice was firm. "I can't stay here, Mr. Grayson. It's not right." "Elliot," he corrected automatically. "And why isn't it right?" She turned to face him then, and he saw the steel in her that he'd missed before. The backbone that had kept her going through months of impossible circumstances. "Because I know how this works," she said. "Rich man helps poor girl, and eventually there's a price. There's always a price." The accusation stung, partly because he couldn't entirely deny it. How many times had he helped someone with ulterior motives? How many charitable donations had been calculated tax write-offs or publicity moves? What if there wasn't a price, he asked. What if I just wanted to help? Nobody just wants to help. Not people like you. People like me? Billionaires don't do charity without expecting something in return. A tax break, good publicity, or… She trailed off, but he knew what she was thinking. Or sexual favors. The implication hung between them like a slap. "Is that really what you think of me?" "I don't know what to think of you," she said honestly. 6 months I've worked in your home, and until last night, I don't think you ever really saw me. Now suddenly you want to rescue me? Forgive me if I'm suspicious." She had a point. A devastating, uncomfortable point. "You're right," he said finally. "I didn't see you. I saw a function, someone who made my life easier without complications. That was wrong of me. But, because there was clearly a but coming. But finding you on that street changed something. I can't just go back to pretending I don't know what's happening in your life." "Why not? It would be easier for both of us." "Would it? Would it be easier for you to sleep in shelters and doorways, knowing I have 8 empty bedrooms in this apartment?" She flinched. "That's not fair. None of this is fair. It's not fair that you're working 3 jobs to keep your mother alive. It's not fair that your brother might not get to go to college because you can't afford to support him and pay for your mom's medical care. It's not fair that I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes while you're choosing between food and shelter." "Life isn't fair," she said quietly. "I learned that a long time ago. Maybe not. But that doesn't mean we can't try to make it more fair." She stared at him for a long moment. "What are you suggesting?" The question caught him off guard because he hadn't really thought it through. He was operating on instinct, on the unfamiliar feeling of wanting to fix something for someone else. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But running away to sleep in another shelter isn't the answer. It's not running away. It's maintaining appropriate boundaries." "Appropriate boundaries?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Callie, appropriate boundaries went out the window the moment I found you nearly dead from hypothermia outside my building." She set down the spatula and crossed her arms. "So what do you want from me? I want you to eat breakfast. I want you to sleep in a real bed. I want you to stop looking over your shoulder, waiting for the next disaster. And in return, nothing. There's always something. Not this time." They stared at each other across his kitchen, both stubborn, both afraid, both teetering on the edge of something that could change everything or destroy what little stability she'd managed to build. Finally, she sighed. "I have to go to work." "Where?" "The office building downtown. I clean the law offices before they open." He glanced at the clock. 8:15 a.m. "How do you usually get there?" "Subway." "I'll drive you." "That's not necessary." "Maybe not. But I'm doing it anyway." The drive across town was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than the night before. Less desperate, more thoughtful. He found himself stealing glances at her profile, trying to reconcile this composed, dignified woman with the broken figure he'd found in the rain. "The building on 5th, she said as they approached downtown. "You can drop me at the corner." But when they pulled up to the building, Elliot saw something that made his blood run cold. A sign in the window, "Office space available. Building under new management." "Callie," he said quietly. She followed his gaze and went very still. "No, no, no, no." She was out of the car before he could stop her, running toward the entrance. He followed, catching up as she reached the security desk. "Excuse me," she said to the guard, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I'm looking for the cleaning supervisor. I work the morning shift." The guard, a tired-looking man in his 50s, shook his head sympathetically. "Sorry, miss. Cleaning contract got terminated yesterday. New management companies bringing in their own people." The color drained from her face. "But I was just here Tuesday." Nobody said anything about. "It was real sudden," the guard said. "They posted notices yesterday afternoon. Most folks didn't even know until they showed up for their shifts." Elliot watched as the last bit of stability in her world crumbled. One of her 3 jobs, gone. Just like that. "Thank you," she whispered to the guard, then turned and walked back toward the car on unsteady legs. He wanted to say something, anything, to make it better, But what was there to say? That it would be okay? That she'd find another job? They both knew how hard it was to find work that fit around her other obligations. How much did that job pay? He asked as they sat in his car outside the building. $400 a week, she said dully. Cash. $400. Not even enough to rent a decent apartment in the city, but for her, it was the difference between survival and disaster. I can lend you. No. The word was sharp, final. I won't take money from you. Why not? Because then I really would owe you something. They drove back toward his building in silence. But this time, it was heavy with unspoken tension. She was calculating. He could see it in the set of her shoulders. Trying to figure out how to make the math work with one less income. There has to be other cleaning jobs, he said finally. Maybe. But most places want you to work specific shifts. I can't do that with my other jobs. What if you didn't have other jobs? She looked at him sharply. What do you mean? What if you had one job that paid enough to cover everything? Doing what? I don't have a college degree, Mr. Grayson. I don't have special skills. I clean things. That's what I do. You do more than clean things, he said. You organized my entire home office last month without being asked. You figured out a system for my files that my assistant couldn't manage in 2 years. You coordinate with my housekeeper, my dry cleaner, my doorman. You anticipate problems before they happen. Those are just basic organizational skills. No, they're not. They're management skills. The idea that had been forming in the back of his mind suddenly crystallized. It was crazy, probably unethical, definitely complicated. But looking at her face, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide, he knew he was going to do it anyway. I want to offer you a different job, he said. What kind of job? Personal assistant. Full-time. Benefits, health insurance, enough salary to cover your mother's medical expenses and your brother's college tuition. She stared at him. You're not serious. I'm completely serious. I don't know anything about being a personal assistant. You know more than you think. And you can learn the rest. Why would you do that? It was the same question she'd asked the night before, and he still didn't have a complete answer. But he had part of one. Because you're the most competent person I've ever met, he said. Because you show up every day and do excellent work without being asked. Because you're honest and reliable and you don't give up. And because you feel guilty. Yeah, he admitted. That too. She was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the city rushing past. What would people think? She asked finally. Your business associates, your friends. A maid suddenly becomes your personal assistant. I don't care what they think. You should. Image matters in your world. Some things matter more than image. When they reached his building, she made no move to get out of the car. They sat in the parking garage, the same garage where he'd found her 12 hours earlier, and he waited for her answer. If I said yes, she said finally, it would have to be a real job, with real responsibilities and professional boundaries. Of course. And if it doesn't work out, if I'm not good at it, you have to promise to fire me instead of just keeping me around out of pity. Deal. And you have to stop looking at me like I'm some wounded bird you need to rescue. That one stung because it was probably accurate. How should I look at you? Like I'm someone who's capable of rescuing herself, given the right opportunities. He studied her face, seeing the pride and determination that had kept her going through months of impossible circumstances. She wasn't asking for rescue. She was asking for a chance. So is that a yes? She took a deep breath. It's a yes to the job, but I'm still not staying in your apartment. Where will you stay? I'll figure something out. I always do. But even as she said it, they both knew the truth. She was out of options, out of places to run. The shelter waiting lists were months long, and winter was coming. Still, he didn't push. He'd learned something about Callie Torres in the past 24 hours. The harder you pushed, the more likely she was to disappear entirely. Okay, he said. We'll figure it out as we go. She nodded and got out of the car, but before she closed the door, she looked back at him. Thank you, she said quietly. For the job, I mean. Thank you for saying yes. As he watched her walk toward the elevator, Elliot realized he'd just made a decision that would change both their lives in ways he couldn't begin to predict. The question was whether it would change them for the better, or whether he'd just created a situation that would destroy them both. 3 weeks later, Elliot barely recognized his life. His office ran smoother than it ever had. His calendar was organized, his meetings were productive, and somehow Callie had managed to solve problems he didn't even know he had. She'd negotiated a better rate with his accountant, found a more efficient system for his travel arrangements, and diplomatically handled 3 different crisis situations with clients. She was brilliant at the job. Better than brilliant. She was intuitive in a way that made him wonder how he'd ever functioned without her. But she was also slowly killing herself. Every morning she arrived at his office looking more tired than the day before. Her clothes, though always neat and professional, were clearly the same few outfits rotated endlessly. She ate lunch at her desk, when she ate lunch at all, and worked late without being asked. Most troubling of all, she'd never told him where she was staying. "The Morrison contract needs your signature," she said, appearing in his doorway with a stack of papers. It was 7 p.m. on a Friday, and the building was nearly empty. "Callie, go home. I just need to finish organizing your files for the Singapore trip. The trip isn't for 2 weeks. Go home." She hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, he saw the truth she'd been hiding. "You don't have a home to go to, do you?" Her back straightened. "I have a place to stay." "Where?" "That's not your concern." "Like hell it isn't." He stood up, moving around his desk. "Callie, where are you sleeping?" "I'm managing." That's not an answer. They stared at each other across his office, the familiar battle of wills that had become routine over the past 3 weeks. She wanted to maintain her independence, and he wanted to help her in ways she wouldn't allow. "Fine," he said finally. "Don't tell me. But I'm walking you out, and I'm following your taxi to make sure you get wherever you're going safely." "You can't do that." "Watch me." She glared at him, clearly calculating whether he was bluffing. When she realized he wasn't, her shoulders sagged in defeat. "There's a 24-hour laundromat in Queens," she said quietly. "I sleep there sometimes. The owner lets me stay if I help with the overnight wash." A laundromat. She'd been sleeping in a laundromat for 3 weeks while working as his personal assistant, maintaining the facade that she had her life together. The image hit him like a physical blow. Callie curled up on plastic chairs between washing machines, trying to rest while industrial dryers thundered around her all night. "Jesus Christ, Callie. It's not that bad," she said defensively. "It's warm and safe and it's not a home. I don't need a home. I need a place to sleep." "Those are the same thing." "No, they're not." Her voice was sharp. "A home is something you can lose. A place to sleep is just practical." The distinction broke his heart because he understood it. She'd learned not to get attached to places, not to think of anywhere as permanent. Because in her world, everything was temporary. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're working yourself to death, sleeping in a laundromat, all because you're too proud to accept help." "I'm not too proud. I'm too smart." She crossed her arms. "I've seen what happens when people like me accept help from people like you. We become dependent. We become grateful. And then when you get bored or find someone new to rescue, we're left with nothing." "What if I promised that wouldn't happen?" "You can't promise that. Nobody can." She was right, and they both knew it. He could die, or lose his fortune, or simply lose interest. Her caution was born from experience with a world that had taught her not to trust anyone's promises. But looking at her, really looking at the exhaustion she was trying to hide, the careful way she held herself together, he realized something had shifted in the past 3 weeks. This wasn't about charity anymore. It wasn't even about guilt. Somewhere between watching her handle his most difficult clients with grace and seeing her work 14-hour days without complaint, he'd started to care about her. Not as a project or a responsibility, but as a person who mattered to him. "What if we made it a business arrangement?" he said suddenly. "What do you mean?" "Live-in personal assistant. It's not uncommon for executives to have staff who live on site. I'd pay you extra for the convenience." She studied his face suspiciously. "You're making that up." "I'm not. My lawyer has a live-in housekeeper. My accountant has a live-in nanny. Rich people do it all the time. And if I said yes, what would that look like? You'd have your own space in the apartment. Your own entrance if you want it. Professional boundaries, just like you asked for." "How much extra?" The question surprised him. Not that she'd asked. She was too practical not to. But that she was considering it at all. "How much do you need?" That's not how negotiations work. Despite everything, he almost smiled. Even exhausted and backed into a corner, she was sharp enough to call him on his tactics. "You're right. What would make it worth it to you?" She was quiet for a long moment, and he could practically see her doing calculations in her head. $1,500 a month, she said finally, on top of my salary. And I pay for my own food. It was probably a quarter of what he spent on wine in a month, but he managed to keep his expression neutral. Deal. Just like that. Just like that. Why? It was becoming her favorite question, and he was running out of ways to answer it honestly without scaring her away. Because I sleep better knowing you're not in a laundromat in Queens. She blinked, clearly not expecting that level of candor. That's not a good business reason. No, he agreed. It's not. The admission hung between them, changing something fundamental in the air. They'd crossed a line from employer and employee to something more complicated, something that didn't have clear rules or boundaries. I need to think about it, she said finally. How long? Give me the weekend. Okay. But Callie. Yeah. Don't go back to the laundromat tonight. There's a hotel across the street. I'll put it on the company card. I can't. You can, and you will. Consider it a business expense. I need my personal assistant to be well rested. She looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out over pride. One night, she said. One night. But as she gathered her things and headed for the door, Elliot found himself hoping she'd say yes to his offer. Not just because he wanted to help her, but because somewhere over the past 3 weeks, his sterile penthouse had started to feel empty in a way it never had before. Monday morning, she was waiting in his office when he arrived. I'll take the job, she said without preamble. The live-in position. Relief flooded through him so quickly it left him dizzy. Good. But I have conditions. Name them. First, this is a professional arrangement. I'm not your friend, I'm not your charity case, and I'm definitely not your girlfriend. Understood. Second, I want a contract. With specific terms about my living situation, my responsibilities, and what happens if either of us wants to end the arrangement. I'll have my lawyer draw something up. Third, if this doesn't work out, if I can't do the job, or if the living situation becomes uncomfortable, you give me a month's notice and a good reference. Deal. And fourth, she hesitated, then seemed to steel herself. If you ever try to take advantage of this situation, if you ever make me feel like I owe you something beyond professional courtesy, I walk. No notice, no reference, no explanation. The condition stung, but he understood why she needed to say it. Fair enough. Okay then. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. I've drawn up a preliminary budget for integrating my living expenses into your household accounts. I've also prepared a revised schedule that takes into account my availability for evening events and weekend travel. He stared at the folder, then at her. You spent the weekend preparing for a job you hadn't even accepted yet? I like to be prepared. This is incredibly thorough. I told you I was good at my job. She was more than good. She was extraordinary. And looking at the meticulous planning she'd put into making their arrangement work, he realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Callie Torres wasn't just surviving. She was strategizing. Every move she made was calculated to build towards something better. She wasn't a victim of her circumstances. She was a fighter who'd been dealt a terrible hand but refused to fold. When do you want to start? He asked. I already have. She pulled a key from her pocket. I picked this up from building security this morning. I'll move my things in tonight. What things? She gave him a look that was almost amused. I don't have many possessions, Mr. Grayson. It won't take long. Elliot, he corrected automatically. We should probably stick to Mr. Grayson during business hours. Professional boundaries, remember? He nodded, though something about the formality bothered him. After everything they'd been through, after all the barriers they'd crossed, they were back to surnames and careful distance. But maybe that was what she needed. Maybe it was what they both needed. There's one more thing, she said as she reached the door. What's that? Thank you for giving me a chance to prove I can take care of myself. And then she was gone, leaving him alone in his office with the strangest feeling that his life had just changed direction again. This time, though, he wasn't sure where they were heading. 2 months into their new arrangement, Elliot had to admit it was working better than he'd imagined. Callie had transformed not just his office, but his entire life. She'd reorganized his schedule to maximize productivity, streamlined his business processes, and somehow managed to make him actually enjoy the administrative aspects of running his company. More than that, she'd brought a warmth to his sterile penthouse that he hadn't realized was missing. Not because she'd changed anything physical, she was too careful about boundaries for that, but because there was life in the space now. The sound of someone else moving around in the morning, the smell of real food being cooked in his kitchen, the comfortable presence of another person who belonged there. It was dangerous how quickly he'd gotten used to it. Your 3 o'clock is here, she said, appearing in his office doorway with that quiet efficiency that had become so familiar. Which 3 o'clock? Mrs. Chun from the Literacy Foundation. She's hoping you'll consider a major donation. Right. Another charity meeting. He had 3 of them scheduled this week, all hoping to convince him to part with his money for their causes. Give me 5 minutes, then send her in. But instead of leaving, Callie lingered in the doorway. Something wrong? He asked. May I ask you something? Of course. How do you decide which charities to support? The question caught him off guard. In 2 months of working together, she'd never asked about his personal business decisions. Usually, tax implications and publicity value, he said honestly. Why? I was just curious. You have a lot of people who want your money. That's what happens when you have more money than you know what to do with. She was quiet for a moment, then nodded and left to get Mrs. Chun. The meeting went exactly as he'd expected. Mrs. Chun made her pitch about literacy programs in underserved communities, showed him statistics about reading levels and educational outcomes, and asked for a donation that would be substantial for her organization but barely noticeable in his budget. He wrote the check because it would look good in the business journals and because his accountant had told him he needed more charitable deductions this year. But as Mrs. Chun left his office with tears of gratitude in her eyes, he found himself thinking about Callie's question. How did he decide which charities to support? The honest answer was that he didn't, really. He gave money to organizations that enhanced his reputation or provided networking opportunities. He attended charity galas because they were good for business. He supported causes that made him look good to his peers. He'd never given money to anything because he actually cared about the cause. That night, he found Callie in the kitchen, cooking dinner while reviewing financial reports on her laptop. It had become their routine. She'd cook, he'd provide wine, and they'd discuss the next day's schedule. But tonight, he was more interested in their afternoon conversation. Why did you ask me about charity donations today? She looked up from her laptop. Just making conversation. No, you weren't. You don't make small talk. You had a reason. She closed the laptop and leaned against the counter. Do you know what the average person makes in this city? Roughly $58,000 a year. Do you know what my mom's medical bills cost last month? He waited. $12,000. For 1 month. Her insurance covered maybe half of that. The numbers hit him like a physical blow. He'd known her mother was sick, but he'd never really calculated what that meant in concrete terms. The Literacy Foundation you donated to today? They run an after-school program in my old neighborhood. My brother David went there when he was younger. It's probably the reason he's smart enough to get into college. I didn't know that. I didn't tell you. But watching Mrs. Chun in your office today, seeing how grateful she was for money that you probably spend on a single meal, it made me think. About what? About the difference between charity and change. She turned back to the stove, stirring something that smelled incredible, and he waited for her to continue. Charity is giving money to make yourself feel better, she said without looking at him. Change is giving money because you want to make something different in the world. And you think I don't want to make anything different? I think you've never had to think about it before. She was right, of course. He'd never had to worry about medical bills or college tuition or whether he could afford food and rent in the same month. His charitable giving had been an intellectual exercise, not an emotional one. What would change look like, he asked. I don't know. That's not my area of expertise. She plated the food and handed him a dish. I just clean things and organize your life. You do a lot more than that. Do I? There was something in her tone that made him look at her more closely. She'd been different lately, more confident in some ways, but also more guarded. As if success in her new role had given her the courage to have opinions she'd been hiding. What's really bothering you, Callie? She was quiet for a long moment, then set down her fork. I got a call today. From the hospital where my mom is being treated. His blood went cold. Is she okay? She's fine. Better, actually. The new treatment seems to be working. She paused. But they wanted to discuss payment options for her ongoing care. How much? It doesn't matter how much. The point is, I'm finally making enough money to help her, really help her, and it's because you gave me an opportunity that no one else would have. You earned this job, Callie. You're good at it. Maybe. But I never would have gotten the chance to prove that if you hadn't found me sleeping in your parking garage. The gratitude in her voice made him uncomfortable. He'd gotten so used to their professional dynamic that he'd almost forgotten how they'd met. Where is this going? I want to understand you, she said simply. You have more power to change lives than almost anyone in this city. You could solve problems that government programs can't touch, help people who fall through the cracks. But instead, you write checks to organizations that already have plenty of donors. What kind of problems? Families like mine. People who work multiple jobs but still can't afford basic necessities. Kids who are smart enough for college but don't have the resources to get there. People who need just a little help to get back on their feet, but who don't qualify for traditional assistance programs. As she spoke, her voice grew more passionate, and he found himself leaning forward, caught up in her vision. You could create something, she continued. Not just donate to someone else's cause, but build something from the ground up. Something that actually changes the equation for people. Like what? I don't know. A foundation, maybe? Something that focuses on working families who are just barely hanging on. The idea hit him with unexpected force. Not just the concept, but the way she presented it. Not as charity, but as change. Not as something to make him feel better, but as something to make the world different. Have you been thinking about this for a while? Since the day you hired me, she admitted. Watching you write those checks, seeing how much money flows through your life. It made me realize how different things could be for people like my family if someone with your resources actually cared about the problem. You think I don't care? I think you've never had a reason to care. It's not your fault. You've lived in a different world your entire life. But now you know me. And through me, you know what it's like for people who don't have safety nets. She was right. 6 months ago, he'd lived in complete isolation from the reality she dealt with every day. Now, watching her navigate the constant stress of supporting her family while building a career, he'd gotten a glimpse into a world he'd never imagined. If I were to start something like that, he said slowly, I'd need someone to run it. Someone who understands the problems from the ground up. You'd find someone. I already have found someone. She looked up sharply. What do you mean? I mean you, Callie. You'd run it. I can't run a foundation. I don't have experience with that kind of thing. You have something better than experience. You have perspective. And you have the most important qualification for running a foundation, which is, you actually give a damn about the people it would help. She stared at him, clearly trying to process what he was suggesting. You're serious. Completely serious. I'd have no idea what I was doing. Neither did I when I started my first company. You learn as you go. This is crazy. The best ideas usually are. She was quiet for a long time, and he could practically see her mind working, considering possibilities and obstacles in equal measure. What would something like that even look like? She asked finally. I don't know, but I think we should find out. You don't think I'd let you have all the fun, do you? For the first time since he'd known her, Callie Torres smiled. Really smiled, and it transformed her entire face. When would we start? How about tomorrow? 6 months later, the Grayson Foundation for Working Families had become the most talked about charitable organization in New York. Unlike other foundations that focused on broad, systemic issues, they zeroed in on individual families caught in the gap between poverty and stability. They paid medical bills for parents who couldn't afford insurance. They covered college tuition for kids whose grades were good enough, but whose bank accounts weren't. They provided emergency housing assistance for families facing eviction. Most importantly, they did it quietly, without fanfare or publicity, focusing entirely on impact rather than recognition. Callie had thrown herself into the work with an intensity that amazed and worried Elliot in equal measure. She'd learned grant writing, fundraising, and nonprofit management with the same focused determination that had made her an exceptional personal assistant. But more than that, she'd brought a passion to the work that was infectious. Watching her interview potential recipients, seeing the way she connected with families in crisis, he'd realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Callie Torres wasn't just good at helping people. She was born for it, which made what he had to tell her tonight so much harder. He found her in the foundation office they'd set up on the 3rd floor of his building, working late as usual. The space looked nothing like his sterile corporate offices. Callie had insisted on warm colors and comfortable furniture, creating an environment that felt welcoming rather than intimidating. Don't you ever go home? He asked from the doorway. She looked up from a stack of applications. I could ask you the same thing. I live upstairs. What's your excuse? Tomorrow's board meeting. I want to make sure we have all the numbers right. The board meeting. The quarterly review where they'd present their progress to the small group of advisors they'd assembled. The meeting where he'd planned to make an announcement That would change everything. Callie, we need to talk. Something in his tone made her look up sharply. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. But there's something I need to tell you. She closed the file she'd been reviewing and gave him her full attention. Over the past 6 months, he'd learned to read her expressions, and right now she was bracing for bad news. The foundation has been more successful than either of us imagined, he began. That's good news, not something we need to talk about. It's successful enough that it's attracting attention from other organizations, including some very large ones. What kind of attention? The Morrison Family Trust wants to partner with us. They're offering to triple our funding and expand our reach nationwide. She blinked. That's incredible. We could help thousands more families. Yes, we could. But they want to absorb us into their existing structure. The Grayson Foundation would cease to exist as an independent entity. Oh, she was quiet for a moment, processing. What do you want to do? It's not what I want to do. It's what's best for the families we're trying to help. With Morrison's resources, we could have 10 times the impact. That sounds like you've already decided. I have. We're going to accept their offer. Okay. Her voice was carefully neutral. When the transition would happen over the next 3 months. And after that, this was the part he'd been dreading. After that, the program would be managed by Morrison's existing staff. They have people with decades of experience in large-scale operations. The implication hung between them like a physical presence. They wouldn't need her anymore. I see, she said quietly. Callie, no, it's fine. It makes sense. I knew this was temporary. It doesn't have to be temporary. Morrison has offered you a position with their organization. Doing what? Regional coordinator. You'd oversee their East Coast operations. Sounds like a promotion. It is a promotion. Good salary, excellent benefits, the chance to help even more families. But it would be based in Boston. You'd have to relocate. Boston, 300 miles away from everything she'd built here. Away from her mother, her brother, the life she'd finally managed to create. Away from him. I'd get relocation assistance, I assume. Of course. And they'd help you find housing, get your family set up with medical care in Boston. It's a very generous offer. It sounds like it. Her voice was so carefully controlled that he knew she was furious. Or hurt. Or both. You don't have to decide right away, he said. Take some time to think about it. How much time? Morrison wants an answer by the end of the week. 5 days. Yes. She nodded slowly, then turned back to her computer. I should finish these reports for tomorrow's meeting. Callie, talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking. I'm thinking I have work to do. The dismissal was clear, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Not when she was sitting there looking so small and carefully composed. This isn't how I wanted this to happen, he said. How did you want it to happen? I don't know. I just thought we'd have more time. Time for what? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with everything they'd never said, all the careful boundaries they'd maintained even as they'd grown closer over the past months. Time to figure out what comes next, he said finally. I think Morrison figured that out for us. What if you said no to Boston? She looked up at him then, and the pain in her eyes was devastating. Then what, Elliot? What would I do? Go back to being your personal assistant? Pretend the last 6 months never happened. You could start your own foundation. With what money? What resources? You think I could just walk away from the chance to help thousands of families because I don't want to leave New York? I think you should do what makes you happy. What makes me happy? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. What makes me happy is knowing that kids like my brother will have the chance to go to college. What makes me happy is knowing that families won't lose their homes because someone got sick. What makes me happy is making a difference in the world. You can make a difference here. Can I? Because it seems like every time I start to build something, it gets taken away. Every time I think I've found some stability, the rules change. The accusation hit him like a slap. That's not fair, isn't it? 6 months ago, you created this foundation and asked me to run it. You made me believe I could build something lasting, something that mattered. And now you're handing it over to someone else because they have more money. I'm doing what's best for the mission. Are you? Or are you doing what's easiest for you? What's that supposed to mean? She stood up, her careful composure finally cracking. It means this is what you do, Elliot. You swoop in and rescue people. And then when it gets complicated, when it requires real commitment, you find a way to pass the responsibility to someone else. That's not true, isn't it? You found me sleeping in your parking garage, and you rescued me. But you didn't want the mess of actually dealing with my problems long term, so you hired me as your assistant. Then when that got too personal, you created this foundation so you could help me without actually having to be responsible for me. I created the foundation because you had a good idea. You created the foundation because it was easier than admitting you cared about me. The words hung between them like a confession, raw and honest and terrifying. And now, she continued, now that the foundation is successful, now that it's becoming something real and permanent, you're handing it off to someone else. Because permanent is scary, isn't it? Permanent means commitment. Permanent means staying. Callie, no, let me finish. Her voice was shaking now. You want to know what I think? I think you're scared that if you keep the foundation, if you keep me here running it, eventually you'll have to admit that this isn't just about charity anymore. Eventually you'll have to deal with the fact that somewhere along the way, this became personal. She was right. About all of it. He had been scared, terrified, actually, of how personal it had become. Scared of the way he looked forward to their late-night planning sessions. Scared of how empty his apartment felt when she traveled for foundation business. Scared of the way she'd become the most important part of his day without him even realizing it was happening. You're right, he said quietly. What? You're right. About all of it. I am scared. I am passing the responsibility to someone else because it's easier than dealing with how I feel about you. She stared at him, clearly not expecting him to admit it. But you're wrong about one thing, he continued. I'm not doing this because I don't care about you. I'm doing it because I care about you too much to ask you to choose between your career and staying here with me. That's not your choice to make, isn't it? If I keep the foundation here, if I ask you to stay, what kind of future am I offering you? A job that depends entirely on my goodwill? A life where you're always wondering when I might get bored or find someone else to rescue? You don't know what I'm wondering, don't I? You've been waiting for the other shoe to drop since the day we met. Waiting for me to disappoint you. To prove that I'm just another rich guy who makes promises he can't keep. The truth of it hit her visibly, and he saw her armor crack. So what are you saying? She asked. I'm saying maybe it's time I stopped making decisions for you and started asking what you actually want. What I want. What you want, Callie. Not what's practical, not what makes financial sense, not what's best for your family or the foundation or anyone else. What do you want? She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes. I want to stay, she whispered. I want to keep the foundation here, and I want to run it, and I want to stop pretending that working with you every day isn't the best part of my life. Then stay. But the Morrison offer. Fuck the Morrison offer. We'll find other funding. We'll build something even better. What if we can't? Then we'll fail spectacularly, and at least we'll have tried. She laughed through her tears. That's not a very sound business plan. I've never cared less about sound business plans in my life. He crossed the room then, closing the distance between them until he was close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. Callie, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Okay, if money wasn't a factor, if you could have anything you wanted, what would your life look like? I'd run the foundation. I'd help families who need it. I'd make sure my mom gets the best medical care and that David goes to college. And I'd stop being afraid that it's all going to disappear. What else? She looked up at him, vulnerable in a way he'd never seen her before. I'd stop pretending I don't love you. The confession hung between them like a bridge, terrifying and beautiful and impossible to take back. Then marry me, he said. What? Marry me. Not because you're grateful, not because I rescued you, but because you love me and I love you and life is too short to waste time being scared. Elliot, that's crazy. Probably. Do you care? She stared at him, searching his face for something. Doubt, maybe, or signs that he wasn't serious. What about the foundation? We'll keep it. We'll run it together. And if Morrison doesn't like it, they can start their own foundation. What about your reputation? What will people say when they find out you married your former maid? They'll say I'm the luckiest man in New York. And if it doesn't work out, then it doesn't work out. But Callie, what if it does? She was crying now, but she was also smiling, and he realized he'd never seen anything more beautiful in his life. Is that a yes? That's a yes to everything, she said. To staying, to the foundation, to you. All of it. When he kissed her, tasting salt and tears and possibility, he realized that for the first time in his adult life, he wasn't thinking about exit strategies or backup plans. For the first time ever, permanent didn't scare him. It felt like coming home. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.